All right, folks, time for camera controls. This is where we actually get into the good stuff. This is where the class really begins, right in here. So let's get in and talk about the camera. First off, the basic controls. Clearly, you're going to want to have the camera turned on whenever you want to use it. Turning it off saves the battery power. When you turn it on, there is a little protective filter in front of the image sensor that will automatically turn on and knock off dust on it. It does this every time you turn the camera on and off. And so it's doing a very good job at help keeping your camera dust free. It's still possible it may get dust. I'll talk on how to address that in a future slide. The shutter release is going to be used for taking photos, obviously, but it's also for waking the camera up. And so the camera does like to go to sleep on a regular basis, and by pressing lightly halfway down on the shutter release, you'll wake your camera up. The main dial on Canon cameras is the top dial used with your index finger, and so for changing any setting on the camera, that's often the first place to go to. Not always, but often. Hallmark of all the higher-end Canon cameras is the quick control dial, or sometimes I'll just call it the back dial on the camera, and that is used in concert with the main dial. Sometimes they do the same thing, sometimes they do complementary things. And in the middle of that is your set button. And so when you highlight an item in the menu system and you say, I want to activate this feature, you're going to be hitting the set button. Occasionally that back dial is not working, and you turn the dial and nothing happens, and that's because in most cases you flip that lock to the right hand side and you've locked the controls on the camera, and one of the things that it does is it locks the dial. It can lock other things, and we'll talk more about that as well. And so if it's not working, just flip that lock over to the left hand side. We also have a little joystick, officially called the multi-controller. This is going to be used for moving your focusing point around, but you can also navigate through the menu system, as well as use it in many other areas whenever you need to go up, down, left, or right. We're going to start taking our tour on the top deck of the camera, and we're just going to go around and talk about all the different aspects. So once again, the shutter release, pressing it halfway down does wake the camera up, because the camera will go to different stages of a sleep after about 6 and 15 seconds, and this will wake it up. But it also activates the focusing system and the metering system on the camera. And so photographers get very used to that half press on the shutter release before pressing all the way down. It's usually a 2-stage pressing that most people go through on their cameras. The biggest and most important control on the top is going to be the mode dial. And this has a lock button in the middle so that you don't accidentally bump it as easily. So it does kind of take 2 fingers to press and turn that at the same time. And this requires a little bit more of an in-depth discussion. So let's talk about the mode dial. We're going to start off on the simplest of the settings, which is the Scene Intelligent mode. It's full auto. But the Scene Intelligent part about this is that the camera is actually looking at what you're shooting at, and it's using its metering system, which is actually kind of a small sensor in many ways, and it's trying to judge what you are shooting and how it should tweak the camera to adjust for those settings. So it can tell that you're shooting a portrait in some cases. All right? It's not good in every case. It can tell if it's a backlit or if it's a close-up, because it can tell where the lens is. And so there's some very, very simplistic thinking that it can do. Now, I believe that anyone who watches this class and gets to the end of it is going to be smarter than the camera is at this point. Now, if you're going to hand the camera to a friend or relative who doesn't know about photography, and you just want to make it as easy as possible on them getting decent shots, this is exactly what this mode is for. This is the friend mode. You're handing the camera off to somebody else. I really don't expect, and I would actually be, I would be disappointed if you said, John, I saw your class on the 5D Mark IV. It was a great class. I've watched it from start to finish, and I look down at your camera, and it's in the A+ mode. I would be truly disappointed that you haven't chosen to take more control of your camera, because there is so much more that you can do once you understand how it works. But it's great for somebody who just has only made it this far and they want to get easy, simple photos out of their camera. Next up is the P button, which stands for Program. And for the most part, it's very similar to the Scene Intelligent mode. It's not analyzing the scene and making adjustments, but it is setting shutter speeds and apertures, and it's taking care of everything else in the camera. One of the things that notably happens in the Program mode is the child safety locks are turned off. in the Scene Intelligent mode, there's a lot of menu items which are now grayed out or completely disappeared from the options, which means you can't get in and make changes on it, which is great for the people who don't know how to use the camera. But as soon as you say, hey, I want to change the ISO, you can't do that in the Scene Intelligent mode. You can do it in the program mode. So the program mode is going to set shutter speeds and apertures for you. And if you turn the top dial, you can do something called program shift. Now what you'll see in the viewfinder, when you look through the viewfinder at the bottom of it, you're going to see a line of information below the image, which is going to give you your shutter speed, your aperture, your light meter, your ISO, and how many images you have left. And we're looking at the first two numbers, the shutter speed and the aperture, and you'll be able to see them change. So let's do a little demo here in the class. Let's go ahead and get my camera set up so you guys can see what's going on in the back of my camera. I have my camera now in the program mode, and to make things easy for you to see them at home, I'm going to press the info button on my camera. I'll talk more about this in a moment, so that you can see exactly what mode I'm in and what shutter speed and aperture I'm at. So I'm at a 50th of a second, f3.5. Now, as I pan around the room here just a little bit, you can see the aperture changes, maybe the shutter speed changes a little bit, depending on where I'm pointing it at. Now, if I said, you know what, 60th at f4 is fine and all, but I need more depth of field. Well, I can take the top dial and I can dial in and stop it down to f16. I'm down at a quarter second, so it's good that I'm on a tripod. But if I'm not happy with the settings, I can just turn the dial, all right? But there is a little quirk to this whole thing. Let's say I do want f16. All right, great, I'm at f16. 1, 2, 3, and I go back, and it's not at f16 anymore. And that's because the camera resets after about 6 seconds. And so if I knew that I wanted to shoot at f16, well, fine, I can go shoot my picture there, but if I let it sit for a few seconds, it's going to reset, and now I got to go reset it again. And so if you want to take pictures repeatedly, a series of photos with particular settings, this is not the right mode. This is when you want to take quick, one-off shots, and maybe you want to change something real quickly. You know, you're shooting a landscape shot, and then suddenly you go like, oh, this would be a good time for a portrait. Let me just quickly change it to a portrait mode and grab a quick shot or two. When you said, oh, wait, okay, we're going to go over here, and we're going to shoot a bunch of portraits, that's when I would take it out of that mode. And so this is not a bad walk-around mode. So if you're on vacation and you're just walking down the street, you're going to the park, and you don't know what your next shot is, program mode is not the worst place to be, because you can safely just point the camera and shoot it. It's going to give you good settings for general photography. And you can dial things in if you want to get a little bit more exact. But when you get to serious photography where you're shooting lots of photos, we're going to move on to something else. Now the back dial controls exposure compensation. So let's talk about what this is. So this allows you to make pictures that are a little bit darker or a little bit lighter. You can work these in third stop increments. So this is what it looks like, 1, 2, and 3 stops underexposed, and 1, 2, 3 stops overexposed. The camera thinks everything in the world is middle tone gray, and it's not. And so this allows you to get in there and make those adjustments and to be able to tweak them so that they're right for any particular situation. So let's do another little demo here, right, so we can see what's going on. And so let's zoom in a little bit. Let me just check, make sure that I'm generally in the right area here. Okay, so if we take a normal picture right here, we're going to get pretty decent results of our stand and background over there. If I said, you know what, I think it's a little dark, let's go -2, and you can see the little graphic indicator right there, and it's going to show you the same thing when you look in the viewfinder. And we'll take that one. That one's going to be notably darker. Let's go to the plus side, and we'll go +2 to make this one notably lighter. And I'm going to play back these 3 images, and I'm going to bring up some information so I can prove to you what I'm doing here. Down here at the bottom, it says +2, -2, and then there's nothing there, which means it's normal. And so there's our -2, and there's our +2. And so if you take a photo and it just doesn't look right, and you think you can make an adjustment either lighter or darker to fix the problem, this is a great way to fix the problem. Now, one of the things you'll notice is that it's still at +2, because that's where we last had it. The camera just went to sleep. I wake it up. It is still at +2. If I turn the camera off, if I take the battery out and I put it all back in, turn it back on, where is it at? It's still at +2. You got to remember to reset that. And so this is something that you want to reset. Now, you'll notice that I was just turning the back dial here. Some people bump this. Well, that's when you can throw on the lock switch, and now it's locked. And so you could turn it on, and you could lock it there, and now it's always locked on. Generally, I like to leave it at 0, but I like to leave this unlocked because I'm pretty conscious aware because it shows me back here, it shows me in the viewfinder, it's pretty clear what's going on. But adjust to your own needs there. So that is exposure compensation. Next up, time value. So this is where you want to control the time. And so if you have something that is moving that you either want to freeze in motion with a fast shutter speed, like an eagle going into a river, you might choose something fast like 1,000th or 2,000th of a second for that. If you see something moving and you want to blur it in the wind, for instance, these scarves here blowing in the wind with a 1-second shot. Now this was shot on a tripod, of course, so that everything else is nice and sharp. You could use a slow shutter speed. And so if you know the time that you want to have, you can just dial the time in. But do be careful of anything that blinks. Anything that blinks is a warning sign. And so let's show you on the back of the camera. Let me move my camera over into the time value mode. And you can see, let's just change this to 1/8 of a second right now. So my camera's at 1/8 of a second, and the camera is figuring out the aperture, which is f8. And if we take a photo, we get a decent exposure. Now, if I just said, you know what? I want to shoot a photo at 1,000th of a second. So I'm going to change this to 1,000th of a second, and I'm going to take a photo. And that photo is seriously dark. Now, you'll notice that I was working so quickly, I didn't have time to pay attention to the fact that the f2.8 is blinking. It's blinking in the viewfinder, and it's blinking up on the top LCD of the camera as well. That's a warning that says, hey buddy, f2.8 still ain't good enough. It's not enough light. So I'm going to have to come back until it stops blinking. And so fastest shutter speed I can get away with in here is about 1/80th of a second, and that gets me a decent exposure. Now, this can also happen on the slow side of it as well. But if that aperture is blinking, that means you don't have the right aperture for that photo to work. And this is one of the reasons why I don't like the time value mode, is it's very easy to go in with a good intention of trying to do something very specific in a photograph, but your lens just doesn't have the capability of it. And so I tend not to use the time value mode except for in very special situations. And for those of you who are a little bit more advanced, one little tip is you could use auto ISO to compensate for any of that sort of air where you don't have enough aperture to work with. The ISO would then kick in. But that's a separate technique we're going to not get into too much right now. And so time value mode, it's interesting and it's useful in particular situations, but I tend to shy away from it for general photography. All right, next up is one of my favorite modes, which is the aperture value mode. And so this is great when you know that you want a specific amount of depth of field. So in a case like this, f22, I want the foreground in focus, I want the background in focus. I'm going to be using a tripod if I need to, if the shutter speeds dictate that I need it. I want lots of things in focus. Or maybe I want to shoot with a very shallow depth of field and have a very, very shallow depth of field in my pictures, and so I'll dial it down to 1.4, for instance, if my lens has that. And so this is my favorite travel photography mode because it gives you pretty specific control over your aperture, which I can also control my shutter speed as far as I look at my aperture, or I'm looking at my shutter speed, but I'm adjusting my aperture. So quick little demo here on the back of my camera for that. Let me go ahead and change my camera over to aperture value to make sure this works right. And so I'm right now at f2.8 at 1/80th of a second, and I will get a decent photo there as far as exposure goes. Now, if I want to stop it all the way down to f22, it's at 0.8 of a second, so nearly a full second. I'll take a photo, and we're getting proper results there. And this is safer than the time value mode because there are relatively few apertures and so many different shutter speeds that can match up to it. So in most situations, it's not always, but in 99% of the situations, whatever aperture you choose, there will be an appropriate shutter speed available to you. Now, you may or may not be able to handhold it, or it may not be appropriate for the subjects you're shooting, but you're going to get a proper exposure. And so let's say I wanted to shoot at a 1/15 of a second. Well, I'm just looking at the shutter speed numbers, and that means I need to be at f6.3 to get that 1/15 of a second. And I can shoot my photo there. And so I can kind of get away with both things here in a very safe environment. You're not going to end up with bad exposures, overly exposed or underexposed areas when shooting in aperture value. So it's a mode that I frequently use when I don't know what my next shot is going to be, or I just want it to be ready for whatever comes my way. Next up is full manual. The top dial controls the shutter speeds, the back dial controls the aperture. This is good for either tricky lighting situations where your camera might not be metering it properly and you're going to shoot a photo and go, wait, no, that's not quite right. You make some adjustments and you want it to stay there. And that's the other time that I like using manual exposure, is that when I've dialed in the exposure and I want it to be the same consistently, no matter which lens I'm using, no matter where my focal length is, no matter where I'm standing, no matter where the background is, as long as the subject and lighting hasn't changed, and I want to have things maintain their settings, I would use manual. So if I'm going to take a portrait of somebody, and I'm going to go down to the park and I'm going to get it all kind of set up, and we have consistent lighting, it's not changing, I'm going to choose manual exposure so that I can dial in what works for me and keep it there. And I don't want the camera changing it around. So let's look at the back of the camera, and I'm going to flip my camera over to manual mode. And so if I want to set things manually, I'm just going to leave it at ISO 200, that's where it's at right now, but let's just say I wanted to shoot it at f5.6. Well, I can change my aperture using the back dial at 5.6. Now the shutter speed needs to go someplace where the meter is giving me a proper meter reading, and the camera is currently in a light sleep mode right now. And so I'm going to press down halfway to wake the camera up, and I can see that I am more than 3 stops underexposed. And so I'm going to start changing my shutter speed dial until it gets to 0, and that's going to be my first shot. And then I'll look at that and I'll go, hey, you know, maybe I need this a little bit brighter, so I'm going to overexpose by 2/3 of a stop in this case, and maybe that's where I prefer the brightness. And then that's where I'm going to be shooting the rest of my photos in that series. So anytime you plan on shooting a series of photos, you want consistent results, and you're willing to shoot a couple of test photos, manual is what I would go with. And so it's my favorite way of shooting because it means that I'm going to get consistent, good results because I've tested and checked them out ahead of time. And that's where a lot of people are going to be using this camera. Very easy controls on it. So that is the manual mode. Once again, when you see that light meter, if it goes more than 3 stops under or over, you'll just see an arrow that says that it's more and it's outside of the reading areas. And these are, once again, in 1/3 stops. Each full stop is a double or halving of the amount of light. And a good place to start is with it at the center for your first exposure, depending on the subject, of course. Next up, bulb, which is an extension of the manual mode. The longest shutter speed you can go with in this camera is 30 seconds. That's the longest in most cameras. But every once in a while you come across a situation where you want to use a shutter speed longer than 30 seconds. For instance, when I was in Rome, I wanted to capture as many taillights as possible, but in any 30-second span of time, there wasn't as many taillights as I had hoped for. And so I put the camera into a bulb mode where I shot for about 2 minutes so that I could get more taillights in the shot. And so the bulb timer is for any sort of image over 30 seconds in length. And so the way bulb works is that when you press down on the shutter release, it opens up the shutter and it stays open as long as your finger is on the shutter release. And then when you remove it is when it stops. And so you have to stand there with your finger on the camera for 2 minutes. Now that is a terrible technique because you would be moving and vibrating the camera. And that is why they make the timer remote control, and there's a couple different models of these I'll talk more about. So you use the cable release to trigger it, hold it. Now these actually have a lock, so you don't have to physically hold the button in on the camera to do it. And if you wanted to do these long exposures, this is how you had to do it in previous generations of Canon camera. But now Canon has added a new feature in this camera, and this is going to be in the menu, and it's called the bulb timer. And this is an introduction to something else in this class, is I'm going to give you shortcuts. Because I know some of you watching at home are saying, John, he just keeps on talking. I want to go in and I want to make this change right now. So if you dive into your menu system On shooting page tab number 4, there's something called bulb timer. And there you can set a specific amount of time, 1 minute, 2 minutes, 10 minutes, however long you want for the bulb timer. So you don't need to buy that cable release anymore. You can still use it if you want to, but if you do want to do a 5-minute exposure, dive into the menu. You got to have the camera in the bulb mode. You dive into the menu, and then you set the bulb timer for 5 minutes, and that way you don't have to touch the camera. You're not touching the camera while it's actually shooting. Now, just as a general recommendation, leaving a digital sensor turned on for a long period of time is A, going to cause noise problems, and B, might damage the camera if you left it on long enough. If you did a 10-hour exposure pointing your camera at the sun, that could be a serious problem on your camera. I would recommend keeping your bulb timings to 15 minutes and shorter. I don't have a specific, there isn't a listing in the Canon as to when it explodes on you or something like that, but I've had very poor luck doing really long exposures with a digital sensor. The longest that I've personally gone is about 5 minutes. I've seen people who've gone 15 minutes, but anything beyond that is just really pushing the limits of what our sensors can handle, and they heat up too much in that period of time. But it's great for those 1, 2, 3, 4 minute exposures that you want to do. C1, 2, and 3 are custom modes that we get to go in and customize how they work. They can be manual, they can be aperture priority, time value, program mode, and they can have a whole bunch of other features that are added into them. You can have specific metering and drive mode set in. You can have specific focusing systems built into each one of these modes. A common system would be, for instance, maybe a wedding photographer who has C1 for their main chaotic wedding activity, you know, kind of a little bit of action, things moving around, but maybe C2 is more of their portrait mode, where they have a little bit more stability in their setup and people aren't moving around as much. And maybe C3 is for nighttime work. Another one would be a landscape photographer who has C1 for working off of a tripod. But they're also into bird photography, so they set C2 for birds in flight. And they have different focusing systems and different shutter speeds and ISO set so that when they simply flip it to one of those, they can get good pictures very, very quickly. And so, like, if you were a mom or dad and you want to take pictures of kids, you know, I would probably set like C3 for, you know, chaotic kid activity, where you have it set to like ISO 1600 and focus tracking for them moving around. So anytime you just want to throw it into something where you can get decent pictures in the most chaotic situations, you can just throw it in that mode and have everything set and ready to go. Now, if you want to do that, what you do is you set the camera up exactly the way that you want it to work, and then you dive into the menu system, set up page number 5, custom shooting mode, and you register that to either C1, C2, or C3. And there'll be some more specifics, and we'll talk more about this when we come back around to this going through the menu system. And so, highly encourage you to figure out what's important to you, what are some things, some, you know, safe setups that you would want to use on a regular basis, and dial those in and customize your camera.